Hello, everyone, and welcome to our virtual client summit. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Michael Meslansky, and I'm the CEO of Meslansky & Partners. We are so thrilled to have you here, even though you're not physically here with us. But one of the big things, and we're seeing it already in the chat, is that you know us, we know you, many of you know each other, and so hopefully this interaction in the chat will continue as we get started. We are down here in downtown Manhattan at our offices. Lee and I have not been together for 6 months, and we are really happy to be here. We're social distancing. We're gonna go the wrong way, try and high five, but we're right next to each other, and we're really excited to have you here today.
So this is a new platform to us. We've been doing a lot of research on how can we get everybody together and make us feel as close as we can. So we're asking that you participate, that you engage, that you add comments in the sidebar. If there's something that resonates with you, if it drives a question, please feel free to put it up there. We want to hear from you, and we're going to do our best throughout the session to answer those questions or address any comments or feedback you have. I also want to say that in this room, we're family. So the Chatham House rules apply. Anything that stays here, is said here, is going to stay here, and we ask that you all respect that as we go through this, because we want this to be a place where we can really engage and talk about the challenges of communicating in this new environment. And so as we get this rolling, let's give it a test. I want to see how the platform works. We want to hear from you, and I'd love to know what you miss most about pre-pandemic life. I'll tell you one of the things that I realized coming in the office today, it's been 6 months since I set foot in here, and I've almost gotten used to the new normal, except that I realized how much I miss the old normal, how much I miss seeing my colleagues and just being in person and being able to say, you know, it's a rough day, let's go grab a drink, and just having that release and that real human connection. So I think that to me today is the thing that I'm missing the most, but it changes day by day. Feel free to share with us on the side what you miss the most. And Michael, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, what do I miss the most? I actually miss walking around the office and seeing the team. It is great. We got a couple of us got together for the first time a few days ago to be in person and grab a beer together. But there's kind of no replacement for being able to spend some time together and just catch up. How about you, Lee?
I mean, outside of just the engaging of people, I also miss the things that you did just to release stress that you didn't even realize you could do, like I'm going to go get a manicure and pedicure today. That sounds so basic, but those kinds of things that you just did for yourself that you can't do easily anymore. I miss all of those things as well.
Great. Actually, I would say I was kind of happy to put on a jacket today and get dressed. It wasn't a bad thing after so much time not having to do that. And what do we have? So we've got a lot of people here missing informal conversations, ideation in person, walking to the office in Alexandria from a work perspective, missing connecting with colleagues live music, live meetings. It is as we do research these days, it's often a question that we start with of kind of what do you miss, and finding that we often have we have so much that we can relate to. When it comes to talking about how the pandemic has changed us. And we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about the impacts of that on us in our conversation. But I think where we want to start is first of all recognizing that so many of you on the Crowdcast have really informed many of the insights and conclusions that we're drawing today. We've got people on from the pharma and healthcare industry, from financial services, energy, consumer packaged goods, tech and telecom. Now, if I miss anybody, it's going to be a problem. But from so many different industries that we do work in, and we get to have these conversations with many of you in the context of our individual engagements. And so this is an effort to kind of bring them together and distill them down into a core set of insights. And so I want to set the stage first and talk about where we are. And we made a conscious decision kind of not to focus too much on the data that's out there about how the world has changed as a result of the pandemic, but just want to kind of give a broad overview. If any of you are not familiar with the deck on the left by Bruce Mehlman, it is his quarterly decks are some of the best information to really distill down what's going on in the world. And what you can see here is that he points out that 2020 is really a year unlike any other. It's no surprise, but when you see that this is really the first time we've seen recession, pandemic, protests, and an election all happen at once, it starts to put in perspective just how disrupted our normal life has become. What's interesting is that as much as we talk about the change that's happening in the context of the pandemic and Black Lives Matter, that a lot of these are inflection points or tipping points, but they're not all turning points. And what I mean by that is that and we see it in so many of the headlines in different parts of the world and different industries and things like that, that this is the great accelerant. It is really making us move at 100 miles per hour, things that we were doing much more slowly. And that is as true in the context of the communication insights and lessons that we have as it is in the broader world and different parts of different industries that you may be dealing with. I think as we think about the industries that you operate in, you're so different and the challenges are so different, but in many ways you share similarities. You know, if you think about whether it's if you're a supply chain driven organization, or just an organization that had to shift your call centers from a physical location to remote work, there's no question that the experience that you're able to deliver to consumers or customers, depending on what you call them, has changed. The fact that many of us have all moved from in-person work to remote work has had a huge impact on the relationship between staff and management. And the protests that emerged after George Floyd's killing and have kind of really evolved since then have fundamentally changed the way almost every organization has to think about diversity efforts and other efforts both inside their organizations and in the broader world. And so these changes have a huge impact on how people feel and also on how people behave and how we need to communicate with them. Good. You know, as we look at this, we see these two large-scale trends that we want to focus on, and they kind of highlight both the idea of change and acceleration. On the one hand, we've got this idea that people don't feel safe. You know, people they tell us that they don't feel safe physically, emotionally, they don't feel safe financially. On the other hand, we've got people who feel really empowered in ways that they never have been before, and we see that in the cancel culture, in advocacy efforts, whether it's inside organizations or outside of it. We see it in the protests that are happening. So we've got these two trends, safety and power. And when you think about whether we're talking about big changes or big accelerations, we can come back to these two trends and say, all right, well, so if we look at the people who don't feel safe, many of them unfortunately didn't feel safe before the pandemic. And for those people, this is less of a dramatic change than it is perhaps an acceleration or an amplification of those fears. For the people who feel empowered today, if they felt empowered before, then maybe it's an acceleration, but more likely in that area, we're seeing changes there. But in both cases, we've got these questions of safety and power and how they are playing out among our consumers and customers and among our employees. Now, as we go into this, there's one thing that you will not be surprised to know has guided everything that we talk about. And that is that it's not what you say that matters, it's what your audience hears. And what we're trying to bring you here are so many of the results from the research that we've been doing over the last 6 months, quotes from the participants that we've heard in the research, and really trying to pull together all those perspectives into insights that are really easy to get your arms around and our arms around as we move forward.
And so as we talk about these changes, which are huge, everybody's feeling in some ways upside down, and other ways this is the new normal, but would love to know from all of you what's on your mind. What was it about this session that said, I'd like to spend the time learning? I'd love to hear what's on your mind as we get started. I know I've heard from a number of people, and one of the things that spurred all of this was a number of our clients were asking us questions about how do we know what's going to be lasting? What changes are going to be forever? And how do we adapt to this new normal? And so that's one of the things that led us to try to pull a lot of this research together. But would love to hear some more. Feel free to just enter into the chat some things that are on your mind today that you'd hope to leave with.
Yeah, and as we touched on, we will talk about the impact on the customer experience, on how we communicate, but in particular, focus on employees. But would love to hear if there are other areas, other specific issues or topics that are a big focus in your organizations, so that we can try and touch on them. So, how do we move on in what seems the forever COVID world as the uncertainty continues? Yes, certainly doesn't feel like we're gonna end this anytime soon. What are people that feel like they can plan for, and what feels on hold? Okay.
That's a good question.
Yeah, absolutely. Virtual overload and capturing attention. How do I stay on top of these changes over time? It seems overwhelming. What's the role of brand in this environment? And how does this impact people's belief and confidence in science? Wow. Okay. So we're going to take some of these as fodder as we jump into some of the insights, and we'll come back to them as we fit them into the individual components of what we have to say. But we've taken this down to 5 high-level insights and perspectives, and so we'll jump into that now.
The first area that we want to dig into is this idea of the customer experience. And that for all of us means different things. Some of us, our primary audience is truly consumers or the mass audience. Others are serving physicians, others payers. There's all different varieties that our primary audience is. But this is meant to talk about the experience that we as companies create with those that we serve. And there's a couple of trends that we're seeing here. And the first is, we hear in research all the time, I used to be able to handle the hassle. Now everything is amplified. And so we're seeing this trend towards simplification on how to eliminate hassle, how to take friction out of all the experiences. And we know to an extent, so many of us have had to do that in our jobs, and we're learning how to do that even for our employees every day. How do we deal with the constant fatigue of one Zoom call after another? And so this is something that we all struggle with. And I think that the bottom line is this: to the extent that we can, we need to understand what's most important to the people that we're serving and understand how to just make it simple. So here's an example from the insurance space. Oscar, pretty early on in all of this, they understood one of the things that people were trying to get information about the most was about COVID. You want to understand the coronavirus. You wanted to know where could you go get tested, what was covered, what wasn't. So they put it first and foremost on their website, really, really easy to navigate. Many other insurance companies didn't do the same thing. It was much, much more difficult. You had to go through screens and screens. It was very difficult to get to the information that you wanted. We heard from folks is that's not the experience they're looking for, because in this moment, we're also learning that our customers and the people that we're talking to in research all the time are saying the way you behave right now is going to dictate the way I think about you for years to come. So the extent that we're talking about simplicity, that might not be something new. A lot of us are focused on that. But I think what we're going to talk about next is the thing that I'd really like you to focus on and take away. Because we're all focused on making things easier. We're all focused on eliminating friction. But we're not all telling our customers what we're doing with them in mind. And that, I think, is where the real difference is. So if you think about it, right now, many of you are doing things to make the lives of your customers easier. Many of you in financial services have waived fees. You're not foreclosing on homes. You're doing a lot of things to make lives better. Highlight that. Make it front and center. Make sure that people know what it is that you're doing. The way that we talk about this is in 2 different ways. And so what you're going to see in each of these sections is some things we want you to take away that are active things that you can bring back to your organization. And so the 2 things that I encourage you all to think about as you're trying to create better experiences. First, symbols. Symbols are those things that are symbolic gestures, so the big things that you're doing right now to create a better experience. If you're in the financial service space, it's waiving fees. If you're in pharma, much of it is about reducing the costs of medications. All of those are symbolic gestures, and they go a long, long way. But then there's something else that's a little bit smaller, and this is a thing that we call signals. Those are the things that you're doing each and every day, but you might not talk about them. You might not even be aware that it means something to your customers. So I'll give you an example. If you're a banking center client or a branch client, you're going in to do whatever transaction you have to do in person. I think many of us are trying to avoid going in person as much as possible. And so when you go in, you want to get in and out as fast as possible. And many of you in the financial services space have already thought about that. How do we streamline this? We're not going to do in-person conversations about other products. We might try to make sure that we get people in and out. We have different lines for different kinds of transactions. You're doing all different kinds of things. But a lot of people that are going into your retail banking centers might not even realize that. And so just by training each one of your tellers to do something as simple as saying, hey, you know what? Thanks for coming in today. I know you probably want to get in and out as fast as possible, and that's what it's all about. If you want to have a conversation, happy to do that. Here's my email address. But just that small change in language, that small message that you're sending can have a huge impact. And those are the kind of things that we're talking about that are signals that you're thinking about your customers in a different way in this moment. I will give you one warning, because as we were talking about this, we've also learned that people are in COVID overload. We've heard that people are saying, I get an email, hundreds of emails every day about what my company or that I work with is doing about COVID. That's not necessarily what we're talking about. It's talking about those things that you've shifted and changed to make the experience better for your customer. Highlight those and make sure you talk about them. And I think it's going to have a big impact on the experience that you're creating.
Yeah, I think, Lee, first of all, we are strong believers in authentic communications. And so we are authentically going to acknowledge that every time I look at Lee, to you, it looks like I'm looking out the window. And so, this is our first shot with Crowdcast, and, feels like if we've got audio and video, then we've been pretty successful there. But I am looking at Lee. Because what she's saying is super interesting. But I think the point about signals and about communicating what it is that you're doing, and not assuming that people know what it is that you're doing and why you're doing it, is so critically important. I mean, we've seen it from financial advisors just saying, I want to listen to you, or companies when they're on, when you have customer service calls, actually communicating the why behind the what, or that that you want to do things, for your customers, your consumers. That so often, because we live and breathe, what it is that we're doing, we fail to tell people why it is that we're doing something, or even what it is that we're doing. That signaling power is incredibly important, and so I think it's helpful for people to really focus on that.
Yeah. And I'd love to hear on the chat on the side some things that you've changed that you might not have introduced out loud, that you might not have said to your customers or to physicians or the people that you serve, that we did this because we had you in mind. Would love to hear some of the examples that you have. One thing I can remember a while ago, we're working with an automotive company, and we had the opportunity to tour their factory floors. And the level of detail that goes into quality, to making sure that there's no scratches in the paint, to looking at all of that, was so overwhelming to the team of us who got to go visit that auto plant. And I remember hearing a story from one of them talking about how they used, everybody had sweatbands over their watches and over their belt buckles, and that made sure that nothing got scratched. And we said, wow, that's a really interesting story. You should tell that to everybody, right? And the person who had talked about this said, well, everybody does that in the auto industry. So, well, if you don't tell it, nobody realizes that that's the kind of thing that's going on. So those little things that you do that you might be taking for granted could be really meaningful to your target audience. So I'd love to hear some of those kinds of things that you're all doing.
I think from a brand perspective, in terms of brand storytelling, you all know as well or better than we do, that great stories can be really powerful, and this is that time to kind of pull out those small stories that have lessons embedded in them. We often talk about scalable stories. They are not stories that are just great on their own. They're stories that scale because they teach a lesson about the organization. And finding those stories, I think, is a way to cut through and stand out in this time, particularly if you're doing it in a way that is, it doesn't feel like it is just trying to respond to the moment, but is actually something that's that's going to be true for the long term for you and your organization. All right, so the second area that we want to focus on is, if the first one was about the experience you create, the second is about the messages that we send. And I don't think we've ever seen a time where it is easier to seem out of touch, where there are just so many different things that can trigger a response from your audience that you are missing the boat. You have forgotten what's going on. I'll just, for those of you who have been to emotional response sessions with us or dial sessions with us, you know that we play a practice video before we do the dialing. And that practice video, which is just a way to get people warmed up on how they're going to respond on a moment-by-moment basis, we use a travel video. We talk about the somewhat facetiously, we talk about the benefits of travel and how great it is to be on the road all the time. And we look at people first, turn the dial up and dial down. But when we started using it after the pandemic started, people they could not take it for what it was intended for. It was no longer a practice session. We actually had to divert the groups, the first couple of groups that we did, in order to address the fact that this was just a practice video. And so something that we never would have thought of all of a sudden made us look incredibly out of touch. And I think we're seeing that more and more today, where companies find that things that they did not consider are just out of step with the current reality. And one of the things that we heard in one of our groups is that you can tell who cares and who doesn't by the way that they communicate now. And without question, what we're seeing, it was, I think, at its most intense right at the beginning of the pandemic, but I think it still holds true today, is that people are paying attention. They're paying attention to the tone. They're paying attention to the language that's being used. And they are, in some ways, not looking to catch us out, but they're certainly there when we give them the opportunity to do it. And so, the other thing beyond tone is really just how many words have changed. I mean, these are just the easy ones that we picked. Think about what it's like to talk about high touch service in a touchless environment. Talk about clean, working with some of you on the phone on something where we use the word race to mean a competition, and had to take a step back and really revisit how people were going to respond to that term because of the focus on diversity and on racial justice. Hands-on, normal, all of the language of diversity specifically is being questioned, but there's so many other terms that are being questioned as well. And it's important to take a step back and look at all of our communications through that lens and ask ourselves whether something has changed that we need to reconsider. One of the areas that we've looked at for well over a decade, almost coming on 2 decades now, is just this kind of central belief about people's financial futures. And we've been asking a question over time about whether people think it's a more important priority to focus on achieving financial freedom or financial security. And it's proven to be a really good kind of proxy for the mindset of the consumer. And we often get a question that is, when does your language change? If we do message testing and we come up with the recommendations, how long do those recommendations last? When do we need to reevaluate them? And this question really is a great illustration of what we think the answer is. So if you look at this chart, this roughly follows the percentage of people who say that they prioritize financial independence versus financial security. The gray bars coming down vertically represent the dot-com bust, the financial crisis, and the current pandemic. And what you see is that at the beginning or kind of immediately after the crisis, when you're at a trough, people are very focused on insecurity. So the top part of the graph is very large. Very few are focused on independence. That starts to shift over the course of what tends to be a bull market after these significant events. And then it starts to peak. And it peaked in 18 and 19, where people were very focused on all the things that they could do with this great economy that's been working for many people, not for all people. And then all of a sudden you hit this inflection point. And the significance of that is that all of a sudden, the kind of a fundamental grounding to people's financial future and therefore their future, their ability to plan where they spend their money is flipped on its head. And as a result of that, so many things need to change. It's not just in financial services, it's anywhere where there's really discretionary or disposable income. If you're really focused on just making it through, you're not going to spend money where you don't need to, and so we're seeing a lot of that play out. And so what it means is that we really need to reconsider our insights, the assumptions on which we build our brand and our communication. The other thing that we're seeing a lot when it comes to the messages that we send is that nothing kills credibility faster than a contradiction. And not only are people paying attention to our tone, but they're looking for those places where what we say in our marketing and our branding is not backed up by what is actually happening with their experience with the brand. We've seen, and I've worked with many of you on here. I know, Wendy, you're on here. I told you I was going to refer to some of the work that we had done to contradictions and how kind of important they are in evaluating our brand and our situation. So for those of you who aren't familiar, one of the areas that we focus on when we're working with clients and helping them position either their brand or a particular product is our contradiction alerts and baggage alerts. Now, contradiction alerts are those simple places where you are saying one thing in one channel or seemingly to one audience, but you're behaving in a very different way in a different channel or with a different audience. And because there's so much overlap today, it's very hard to keep those contradictions separate. Baggage alerts are those places where your industry, your company, your product has baggage. There's an ongoing narrative around it that is negative, and you try and ignore it or pretend that it doesn't exist, and it comes back to bite you. And so we look for those because they can just kill credibility immediately. So what do we mean by that? Well, this is an example of Amazon, talking about in the screen on the bottom, talking about the importance of standing in solidarity with the Black community and in really making sure that they are on the right side of this historic moment. And at the same time, there are many people, or were many people at that moment, complaining about the treatment that Amazon employees were getting inside the facilities. It was a contradiction that really amplified the negative news story because it seemed basically hypocritical. For airlines, interestingly, and hopefully we live to see this day, they're seemingly canceling change fees, which I think would be great certainly for all of those who hope to get back to traveling. But they have a lot of baggage because we've lived with these change fees and being kind of nickel and dimed for so long that it's going to take a lot of time and energy for people to really believe that there isn't something hiding out there that can come and get them in the course of travel. When it comes to dealing with contradictions, we had a client at a bank who she was the CEO of the bank, and she literally kept a notebook, and it was her contradiction notebook. And she would walk around and say, "We're making all these promises with our brand, but we've got late fees or overdraft fees, or just the way that we serve people is inconsistent with the message that we're trying to send." And so in this moment, we think those contradictions are just so much more damaging than they ever have been before. Now, there's another element of it that I think is really important for everyone to. Thank you, Sarah, for pointing out that airlines have a lot of baggage. I appreciate that. Perhaps you could have given me that ahead of time, and I could have. But there's a kind of an even more serious side of this, and that I know in many of the industries that we're working with, companies have taken dramatic steps to do the right thing by customers. So in the energy space, we've stopped disconnects. In the financial services and housing space, stopped foreclosures and evictions. Companies have stopped layoffs. And those moves were incredibly important and were designed to do the right thing. the challenge that we're going to face is that we all know that there's going to be a flip of that. At some point, these bills are going to need to get paid, and that these delays are not designed to kind of remove the responsibility for people to pay their bill, and that's where the real challenge is going to be in communicating. Is that we're going to have to reconcile the things that we said when we implemented the original policies or programs with the reality that we now have to deal with. And I'll just tell one other quick story about this and kind of where baggage and contradictions come into play. This is actually the first energy research project I ever did, but one of my favorite stories where we were talking about explaining rate increases. And the CEO of the energy company said, I want you to test this message. If we don't raise rates, then our cost of capital is going to go up. And if our cost of capital is going to go up, then we may not be able to cover our interest payments, and that may force us to go bankrupt. So we really need this rate increase. And we said, okay, well, we'll test that if you want us to test it. And we went into testing. And the response that we got was, if you can't manage your business without raising fees, it's not more fees that you need, it's actually a new management team. And there was just this kind of this clear recognition that's so important here, that is, a business justification is not a justification when you have these contradictions. So as we think about, what the lasting changes, what we really need to focus on as we think about the messages that we send, that, first of all, as I just said, good business is not a good reason for things. If we're dealing with these contradictions, if we're trying to explain them, giving an economic or business rationale has never tested well in the decades that I've been doing this. that moments in time have a lasting impact. So the thing that we did yesterday either creates baggage that we need to reconcile today, or the good thing that we did yesterday now makes it harder to shift into what we need to do today. And that the moment requires us to really challenge our insights and our assumptions on which we base our brand message and our marketing messages and every other message. And so the more that we know what our kind of core narratives are and find those contradictions, the more effectively we can address them and use this moment to build trust with our customers and stakeholders as opposed to lose it. So just building on that, one of the questions that I have for you is, as you think about what we face in the next 6 months, recognizing that there's still a lot of uncertainty out there, are there particular areas that you're focused on, either as relates to your industry or larger issues that we're facing? And I mean specifically as it relates to the things that you need to communicate. There's plenty to be nervous about, unfortunately. But in terms of what you as a communicator or a marketer need to think about, what falls into that category? Working from home with my toddler again. I understand why that makes you nervous.
Me too.
Is that right? Well, you have a better
17 months.
Any other thoughts about what is particularly worrisome that you're going to need to communicate in the coming 6 months that either you've been working on, it's been challenging, or will be new? Building trust in a remote environment. Yeah, the return, even the language of return to work. So I don't know how many of you have been on calls where you can't call it return to work because people didn't stop working. Can't necessarily call it return to the office because not everybody worked into an office. It isn't necessarily a change for some people, but even the language there is really challenging. The delayed real economic pain. I think that's one that we really haven't even begun to reconcile yet. We've been fortunate so far in how this has affected many Americans, but that there is kind of inevitably feels like there needs to be, or there will be a reckoning. Thanks for these others. As we get to the third point here, and that's our response to issues. So kind of building on the messages that we send, those are proactive communications and what we need to watch out for. On the flip side is how we respond to issues when we face them. And And we are definitely seeing an acceleration here. I would say it's less about what is brand new and more about what really is amplified and magnified by the crises that we face today. And we see that in many situations, interestingly, as I read the words that we wrote, while I say the benefit of the doubt is gone, there is data out there that says that trust in companies is greater than ever, and that companies have a real opportunity in this moment to accomplish things and to build relationships with consumers in ways that they haven't. At the same time, there is this great underlying skepticism, and that's kind of embedded in this cancel culture, but not just related to that we really need to watch out for in how we respond to issues. And for anyone who works in the public affairs space or in the issue space inside companies, the question has often been, do we need to say anything? Can we just be silent? This is not our issue. We didn't start it. We haven't been dragged into it. And we would say, or many companies would say, to be silent is to be silent. And on many issues that has worked in the past, although I think we've already seen that it's been fewer and fewer. I think today what we would say is that on more and more issues, being silent is being complicit. And that is a message that obviously was seen and communicated broadly in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement. But I think it has broader application than that, where more and more employees and customers are making judgments about the lack of communication as much as they are about communication itself. But there are different ways to respond. And if you are Ben & Jerry's, then your brand is built on this idea of being out there and being bold and appealing to a progressive audience, and really being clear about what you stand for. And it creates opportunities and doesn't have a lot of risks for a brand like Ben & Jerry's. But we also know that if you're in financial services or pharma or healthcare or energy, and most companies in most areas, that your brand is not built on that progressive or just really strong emotional positioning when it comes to issues. And so the idea of doing something like this is really anathema and really scary. And I think what we're seeing is that there are other ways to communicate that you can take advantage of that you can stand up and take a position on issues without getting yourself into trouble or without getting out over your skis. I mean, you've got brands like on the left where Nike put the brand message and changed their tagline just for this moment, for don't do it. But then you also have brands like Netflix that wanted to have a message, but really was not trying to be out there and take a stand to get a lot of attention. They were kind of in the pack, but they were not silent. And that, I think, is really an important distinction, that people were willing to make a comment, take a stand, have a position, which in a way that was risky in some ways, or in a traditional sense. But it's silence that puts people in the spotlight. It's funny, I hadn't thought about this, but we often say when we're moderating our research sessions that the best way to have everybody behind the glass pay attention to you is to not say anything. And it's true here. It really is. If you want attention on you, don't speak up. Don't talk about these issues. Because you see brands like Adidas and others people are looking to them to say, where do you stand? And silence becomes a statement in and of itself. Now, Lee, you want to talk about IBM?
Yeah. So we also have been doing, in addition to all the research that we're doing, we've been analyzing the language from companies since COVID started back in February. So we've analyzed hundreds and thousands of communications at this point. We're trying to identify different trends. One trend that we've seen over the last 2 weeks is that a lot of companies are getting engaged in the election, different than we've ever seen before. Some of them are announcing that they're closing their doors for that day so employees can go out and vote. Others are encouraging people to go out and vote. If you look at what's happening on social media right now. You can't really log on to a site in social media without being encouraged, this is how to register for voting. This is something that is unlike anything that we've ever seen before. And so in addition to really taking big symbolic stands like we saw Nike did with, just don't do it for once, to people who are taking smaller stands with little things, we're also seeing companies engage by saying, we're going to engage in this by doing what we do best. We're going to lean into something that only we can do to make a difference in this moment. So IBM, for example, over the last week has announced that they're going to use Watson to help people in states deliver critical voting information to citizens, because they can use AI to help people understand how they can best vote. And that's something they're going to use to take a stand on a cause. So it's both a message and really leaning into something that's their business expertise. And that's another trend we're seeing. So, and this is new. I mean, in some ways, this is brand advocacy from a company like IBM, who you would not think of as, a company that's going to be out there taking a stand on an issue like this. And so we're seeing this more and more. And the question is, how do you create the language? How do you create the message? How do you take a stand in a way that's authentic, genuine, credible, and right for you as an organization?
Yeah, we're seeing it in many different places. You think about companies that are taking action on climate change, but are worried about using the language of climate change because of the political environment. So how do you make a statement that's really intended to be seen as an action on climate change without using language that's likely to get you into political trouble with one part of the country? There are ways to do it that carry less risk with it. There are other. There will be similar issues and actions that people need to take as the pandemic evolves. And what's interesting is that when we talk to consumers about it, they are not actually looking for every company to have an answer on every issue. That you don't, I've seen there are a number of comments in here about actions, and I'm going to talk about actions more in a moment. But what's interesting here is it's not your ability to communicate how much you've done. It's your willingness to engage, to listen and understand the problem. It's almost more important than the solution. Now, it gets at a really important point that, first of all, not only can listening and communicating that listening, as we said earlier with signaling, not only can that be an action, but we've learned over time in crisis response that there are many other things that you might not typically consider an action that will be viewed that way by your consumers. And so I know we have a number of our friends, Scott and Shirley, on the phone, and others from Procter & Gamble, who we worked with to build a crisis messaging platform called Dynamic Response. And one of the biggest lessons that we took away from analyzing thousands of crisis responses that we had tested was that there are many more actions than you may think. That by saying that we're willing to engage and have a discussion, that can be an action. By saying that we're willing to work with others to find a solution, that's an action. That it does not always need to be, a problem solved in order to demonstrate your commitment. It just has to be a willingness to engage, to take steps, and then to stand by what it is that you said that you were going to do or have already done. And so as we think about, how we respond to issues, there are a couple of things that I think, we see as particularly important. That first of all, on issues, on a very broad list of issues, well beyond Black Lives Matter and the pandemic specifically, I think the bias needs to be to assume that we have to engage, that we have to have something to say, that we cannot wait to be told that we need to say something or to be dragged into an issue before we decide to engage. That we could be bold or we could be kind of wallpaper, but we can't be absent from those conversations. And so having a statement out there, having a position is really critically important, because silence really carries more risk than speech in so many situations. And the positive side of that, and we're going to get into that more now, is that issues actually also carry more opportunity than ever. And that if we approach them in the right way, they are moments of trust with our customers. They are opportunities to separate our brand from the noise. And they just create these relationships that often can't be done just with a product or a service. So, be interested to see in the chat as we keep moving, and maybe we'll have time to come back to it. But are Are there particular issues in your organizations that are hardest to take stands on? You've seen guns, fossil fuels for many organizations that have broad customer bases. What are the other issues that you're having particular challenges with as you approach the world today?
So at the same time as we are talking about taking a stand on issues, we're also in this moment, we're seeing companies stand up and do a lot of great things to help all of the needs that we have as a society. And so the question is, how do we communicate about the good stuff? We have a client who I believe is on, who said, this is the moment where our purpose and values have been put to the test more than any other moment. We have purpose statements on paper, but who are we really in this moment? How are we going to deliver on what those promises are in this moment? We've all been put to the test. We've talked about, as we've gone through this at Ms. Lansky, about a decade ago, we put our values down on paper. And as we've gone through this moment, we've realized that in this, we've seen those values come to life in each of our team members as how we've tried to operate the business. And it's so, so true that it is one of those moments that we're really seeing ourselves come out, and it's a moment to shine. It's an opportunity for us to really, stand out and stand apart.
So Lee, does purpose matter? For a long time, I think people questioned it. They said, focus on your business. Purpose is nice. It doesn't really matter.
I'm glad that you asked that. Because what we're seeing is that purpose-driven companies do better, but that doesn't mean that companies with purpose statements do better. Because being a purpose-driven company means that everything that you do is for this reason. And we have a lot of you on the phone or on Crowdcast, whatever it is that I'm supposed to say that this is. I keep calling it the phone, which makes me feel a little bit like my grandmother. But it's true that this is a moment that things have to come to light and be activated. This can't just be words on a page. But the way that we communicate is going to make sure that we have the impact. Because right now, when I think about all of the good that the organizations that are represented in this meeting have had collectively, it's astounding. It's staggering when you look at how many jobs have been saved, how many checks have been written, how many of you are involved right now in actively looking for the vaccine that's going to make us all go back to normal. Whether there's companies that are represented here who changed their factories, who are making hand sanitizer now, or have been involved in some of the most amazing things. But the question is, how do you know? How do you stand apart in this moment? And so there's a continuum that we're seeing as a trend. And the one side, and nobody on the phone, I promise you, or on Crowdcast today, is going to be viewed as this as opportunistic. And those are the kinds of companies where you see that feel like they're talking about the good stuff, sort of take advantage of this moment. So we're going to assume, let's just take for a minute that off the table for all of us. So then on the other side, there's what we call wallflowers. And then there's companies who are truly making a difference. Now, being a wallflower, there's really nothing wrong with that. In this way, this communicating about all the good stuff that you're doing will build a lot of goodwill among the people who know you well. It works well for your employees when you're talking about people are really proud that you've written big checks, that you're part of the solution, and those kinds of things. It goes a long way. But then there's a few companies who are truly standing out and making a difference. And so the question is, how do you do that? So if you are a company that's laundry listing and you're wondering, how do we break through the noise? I think that was one of the questions we got earlier. How do we break through? Well, in some ways, a lot of companies are doing this right now. They're talking about all of the good things that they're doing, all of them. They're laundry listing them. It's too much for anyone to absorb. But it's our tendency. We want to communicate about all of this, and that makes sense. And for our employees, it's working. They feel really good. They're telling others about it, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But if you're laundry listing, and this is your intention, and that's what it is, that should be what you're trying to do. We're just trying to build goodwill among the people who know us best. We want our employees to be really engaged and know all the good stuff we're doing. We don't necessarily need to stand apart from the pack. But in this moment, you have a huge opportunity to stand apart. You have a huge opportunity to take all of this good stuff that you're doing and become known for it. So I'll give you one example here of a company that's doing that. Pfizer. was talking about, they were covered about why they might be the best to deliver the vaccine. And their CEO is quoted saying, "This is not business as usual. Financial returns should not drive any decisions." In other words, it doesn't matter what it costs. Now, this is an amazing statement by the CEO of a pharmaceutical company. You know, many of you guys on the phone are my dear clients in pharmaceutical companies, and I love you guys because I know very well all of the good that you do. I know very well that you have been part of the race for cures to cancer and all kinds of things, that you're making our lives better each and every day, but that's not the perception externally. Externally, people think about pharma companies as financial companies. They see pharma companies as companies that make way too much money and charge way too much for things that should be free. So this kind of a statement just really goes to the heart of a narrative about pharma that makes it go, wait a second, that's shocking. And I'm going to remember that. And that unexpected digging right into it is what makes it so, so special. And so when you're thinking about communicating the good stuff you do, there's a couple of options you have. If you truly want to stand apart, there's two ways to stand apart. The first is to do the one thing that nobody expects you to do. And that's a pharmaceutical company saying, I don't care what it costs. It's also, we've seen with auto manufacturers saying, you know what, we're going to team together with our competitor to make the safest car. That unexpected moment that makes you go like, wait a second, I never expected to hear that. The other side of this that makes you truly stand apart is to do the one thing that only you can do. Think about Elon Musk talking about early on in the pandemic saying, we're going to convert our factories and we're going to make ventilators. Only he could do that in that moment. Now, I know ultimately Ford did, but what I mean is only those companies had the ability to do that thing. They uniquely had the ability to solve that challenge, and it became symbolic and meaningful. That's the way you truly stand apart and make a difference, where you take all of the good things you do and you really focus on and highlight that one thing amidst all of the other things that you're doing. Now, the other option you have is to talk about the good stuff you're doing in a way that's just, I just want people to know. I want to engage them. And that's okay. And that's good, because in this moment, what we're seeing both from employees, because we're doing a lot of internal comms work, and also from customers, is we just want to know that you're part of the team, that you get that this is one of those moments you need to step to the plate. But if you truly want to stand apart, there's two ways to do it. So my question to all of you is, does your purpose have purpose in this moment? Does it really stand out as something bigger? What are the things that only you could deliver on? Or what are the things that you're most proud of the organization has done since this all started? I'd love to hear a little bit about thoughts on the chat as we move forward.
Yeah, and really that challenge of, is it just a line on a piece of paper on the wall, or is it something that really drives the actions that you take and makes it clear what you should be doing in this moment, what you could be doing in this moment? That's when I think you really start to see what a purpose-driven organization is versus one that has decided to communicate a purpose because they thought it would be helpful. And how you make the most of that opportunity. So we'll keep looking for those as we move on to number 5. And I think, in many ways, this is probably the most kind of dramatic area of change that we're seeing, and it's not entirely new, but it's certainly very different, much more, much louder, much more amplified than it ever has been before, and that the stories of employees are really driving the conversation, both inside outside companies in many organizations. And as we see it, management today is really change management. And if that's the case, then really internal comms needs to be change comms all the time. Everything that we do needs to be focused on how do we bring our people along, how do we catch up to them when they're ahead of us? Because if we look at the tensions going on inside so many of our organizations, they're really incredible and I think unprecedented. So we've got this generational tension where you've got boomers who are starting to leave the workplace, and you've got Gen Z and millennials who are in the workplace now and have come with a different set of expectations about work. You've got, white males who have dominated the workplace in every way for so long, And you've got these new populations and growing populations of diverse groups, whether it's women or people who are diverse based on race, ethnicity, sexual identity, or otherwise, and again, different sets of expectations. You've got left and right. You've got whether it's companies that have tech employees in one part of the country and other employees in other parts of the country where it's literally a geographic divide as much as anything else. The differences between staff and management, philosophy about command and control versus building up from the grassroots. Now we've added really in kind of stark relief the physical versus virtual tension of what does it mean to work remotely? How does that change the relationship inside an organization? My favorite comic, I think, from the pandemic was meet your chief digital transformation officer, and it's COVID-19 because of the acceleration of digital transformation in response to the pandemic, but that's butting up against the traditional customer experience and company operations. And then this battle, which I think is often not really taken account of, which is the situations where internal audiences are actually misaligned with customers, where the values of the people that a company serves are different from the values of the people who work inside the company, and kind of navigating that tension. And so we've got all of these tensions going on, and each of them creates significant challenges, and they kind of affect every touch point, every action, every communication that we have. And if we're not careful about how we communicate, what we communicate, when we communicate, then we really run the risk of creating a lot of trouble or just requiring a tremendous amount of time to address the challenges that have been created. And what we see amidst those tensions is that you've got some people who are ahead of the curve and you've got some people who are behind the curve. So no matter where you are on the curve, you risk alienating somebody. Because even when you're not speaking out about issues, so many communications that we need to make inside an organization have issue implications or have values implications for individuals and for the companies themselves. And so how do you navigate that situation when it is so easy to alienate people? And kind of to make it even more complicated, we know that employees can be our biggest advocates when they really support what it is that we do. We have ambassador programs to try and get them out into the communities. We have many other things that we do to try and activate our employees to tell our company stories. But they also can be our biggest threats. And I don't think that we've seen the nature of that threat the way that we have in many ways in the last year or two, even before the pandemic. We see what's happened at the tech companies with employees taking internal issues and making them external. And we see them in cancel culture where activities that were seen as internal issues perhaps are now really get a lot of media coverage externally. And so we need to think about what those implications are and really be conscious of our communications. I've seen in some of the stream, if there are CEOs who are reluctant to communicate and to engage on these issues, it is much more challenging than it ever has been before. And so how do you help your leadership team get comfortable with being uncomfortable in many ways, with addressing things that they may not think are issues, but that employees are raising as issues? And how do you start to look at the world through the lens of different parts of your employee base so that you can create communication that really resonates with them? Because I think, early in the session, there were a lot of comments in the chat about when will this be over, what's permanent and what's not. And, it is not profound for me to say that even as the response to the pandemic evolves, change is going to continue to accelerate. And a lot of these trends are not going to go away when we have a vaccine or when people no longer need to wear masks. They are just going to continue on. And so management teams, I think, really need to account for that and try and get ahead of it and really try and identify these issues, try and engage employees on them in a really positive way, but recognize that these issues can be bumpy and not let that cause them to stop or avoid the issues, because I think that creates more problems than it solves.
I think it's also one of those moments this internal comms and the way that we communicate with employees, I think is one of the most important things that we can do differently in this moment. And so we've talked about not sharing a lot of data because we're all sort of inundated, I think, with all of the COVID studies and everything else. But one thing that stood out to me is I saw a study where it's something like less than a third of employees feel like they understand what their job is today, the future of their organization is, what's right around the corner. They feel really, really uncertain. And so I think we always looked at internal comms as a department that might be in HR, or it might be a division of communications, but it was somebody's job to do that. And I think the one big change that we need to look at right now is that it's all of our jobs. If you manage other people, your job is to be a better communicator. And we need to help people along the curve, because this is a once in a lifetime moment where we both have to navigate rapid change, but also where amazing progress has been made on issues in ways that I've never seen. I mean, if I think about my career over the last, 7 years, no, I'm kidding. And I think about where we were as women when I started my career. When I think about all of the issues that have accelerated in this moment over the last few years, there's an amazing opportunity to bring people along with us and to help change, how people view the world. And so I think if we all can just look at ourselves a little bit differently and say our job, as much of anything else that we're trying to do, is also internal communications, I think that we're all going to be so much more successful.
Absolutely. All right, and so as we put these questions in here, these thought starters, and we're going to get to some deeper Q&A in a moment. Are there areas that you recognize that you're asking employees to change, and are there new ones? Are there things that are different now, or do you recognize that that really everything that we're doing is asking employees to change in some ways, whether it's the longstanding employees who are asked to adapt to the new employees asked to adapt to the longstanding employees, or otherwise?
And so, I just realized that they're in authentic communications. My slides didn't get into this version. Sure. So I wanted to wrap up and share with you the 5 different areas that we talked about how things change. The first being, we really need to change the customer experience and how we address that. The second being how we respond to issues. The third about purpose in the moment. The fourth about how we engage with communications. And I missed one. Purpose. Responding to issues.
Responding to issues, purpose.
I missed my
employee
slide.
Experience, the messages we send, responding to issues, communicating your purpose, and the employee experience.
There you go. It's the message you send. That's what I missed, which is sort of central, right? So happy to dig in with any of you more about any of those 5 areas. We've been working with clients, have lots of research to back all this up. So I'd love to hear more from you. We've all been attending a lot of virtual events, I think, since this all started. And my metric of success is if I walk away with one thing that I want to take away and apply at work as a result of it. And I'd love to hear a little bit from you guys about one thing that you've taken away that you want to bring back to your organization, or that you'd like to talk about more. And at the same time, as you might share those with us, if you have any questions that you want us to address, feel free to pop them into the chat there as well. So
yeah, and actually, I'm going to pull some from the chat and respond to them if we didn't get to them as we were communicating, as we were talking. So one question, I can't see who it's from because somebody sent it to me separately, but though this was happening before COVID, it accelerated dramatically this year. Americans are flooded with misinformation and disinformation about companies, products, values, science, etc., leading to a complete lack of trust in virtually every institution in society. As far as I'm concerned, beyond all the current crises and uncertainty, that's the one most disheartening, with long-term, perhaps permanent damage. How do we as marketers and communicators tackle this enormous problem? So why don't you take that one, Lee?
That's easy, no problem. This is a real pain point, I think, for a lot of people. But I think what the biggest mistake that we make in these moments is to just get frustrated, assume there's nothing we can do about it, and just list the facts on how do we correct the misinformation. So somebody comes at us and say, it's not true, you didn't donate that money, or you're not a good company, or you're whatever the misinformation that's out there. We try to laundry list the facts that say, no, that's not true, X, Y, Z, without trying to validate somebody's concern. I think the most important thing that we can do in this moment is stop trying to look at others as others and say, why do they feel that way? What is their real concern? What is underneath what they're saying? Why don't they trust me? And how do I address that? It's really about having empathy for the people who are out there, because people are flooded with information. When you look at those two big shifts that Michael talked about earlier, you think about people are feeling scared and people are feeling empowered. But what that means right now is there's a tremendous amount of fear and there's a tremendous amount of anger. And we have those two emotions as sort of the underlying emotion that people are on their baseline. It becomes really, really hard to have a productive conversation if you're going to come back at them defensively or just with facts. The way that you neutralize those emotions is by addressing them in an emotion that's going to make them feel both safe and in control. And so I encourage our clients to really try and say, let's take a step back and say, what is it that's going on there? And then let them know that you hear them and that you understand what their concerns are. And then you can start moving the needle and rebuilding trust along the way. But I'm not discouraged. I'm one of I'm an optimistic person, I think, to begin with, but I don't think all is lost. I think this is one of those moments where actually people are driving, really digging in and wanting connection. And there's an opportunity for companies and brands and all of us to find ways to connect in a way that we never have before. And I think it's going to surprise us.
Well, I'm not sure I'm as optimistic as you about it, but I think the approach is the right one. And I think we have to be optimistic when it comes to this. I think certainly we know for sure that the battle to defeat misinformation and disinformation is not likely to be more information because of all the things that Lee just talked about. And that, if it's a battle of the facts, then chances are, all is lost, and that trying to find a place to get behind what it is that really matters. There've been, great studies on how do you take somebody who is a racist and engage them, or someone who's against gay marriage and have a conversation with them, or on any of these issues. And the answer is always, as Lee said, it's about empathy and it's about trying to find what it is that's behind their point of view. And so, this is hard to do, I think, at scale and in the social media environment that we're operating in. But, I think for many people, one hope of sometimes you need a crisis and a burning platform is that we all then come back and say that it is critical to find areas of common ground and to have empathy for others, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum or on issues or identity or otherwise. And because I think, getting the platforms to fix it is it's a really hard challenge to know where the line is. And so, it may be improvable, but it's not likely to be fixable. To get media companies who really, their business model is kind of built on this to a certain extent, it's very hard to get them to not misinformation or disinformation, but salacious and attractive information. How do you get them to change? It's very hard. Ultimately, has to be driven, I think, from other sources. A couple of other things. So one of the questions that just came up is, with the need to communicate so much, how do we not overload the recipients?
You're gonna kick that one to me too?
Yeah, go for it.
I think that's a really, really important question that we have to, I don't want to say that the answer to everything is about putting ourselves in the other's shoes, but I think it does start there. I think in this moment, there's a lot that we need to communicate and we want to communicate. And the question is that we need to ask ourselves is, what does our target audience need to hear from us? As much as we're saying that we're overloaded with information, we've also seen a lot of studies that people are hungry for information that's relevant to them. So I think the answer is how do you find a way to make sure that you're packaging things up in a way that's relevant and digestible by the people that you're trying to reach? I've seen some really interesting studies, actually, incidentally, on communicating with physicians in this moment. I think early on, a lot of our instinct was, we're not going to do research with physicians because they must be so inundated with COVID because they're treating, they're at the heart of all of this. A lot of our pharma clients, we can't have in-person meetings with physicians right now to tell them our story. And what we're hearing from physicians is they actually want to be communicated with more, not less. They're hungry for more information. And so I think to the extent that we do all feel overwhelmed and our inboxes are inundated, I think we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions before we send out any communication. First of all, is this for us or is it for them? And how do we make it so that it is for them if it's something that we need to communicate? Because I think that's the thing that we're most tired of is, I don't care if you're still open, that's great. Why do I care that you're still open? Let me know what's in it for me. And I think if you can pass that test, you're going to be much more successful in communicating and really breaking through in this moment.
I would echo that. I think, in many ways, fewer messages communicated more consistently, and kind of knowing what it is that you need to communicate and what's in it for your audience. It is the kind of like the easiest principle to quote, and in many ways the hardest to adhere to when your management team or your organization thinks that there's something that needs to be communicated kind of urgently and immediately. Let's see. I'm looking at some of the other comments in here and questions. Latest one. So Paulina, I'll jump on your question here. May have missed this on the word security. I think you were saying that we may need to rethink that word. Is there another word? No, actually, I wasn't so much saying that as the fact that in this world, the messages around security in your part of the business should actually be more resonant than messages around building your assets or achieving financial freedom. Another question that we ask all the time with our friends at Invesco is about whether people believe that or expect to have a dream retirement or a comfortable retirement. And consistently, even in good times, people don't think that a dream retirement represents what they're shooting for. But in this environment, a comfortable retirement, maintaining their quality of life is going to be even more critical because they know it's more at risk. So that's less of an issue. Somebody else, Ed, talked about being brave in your communications, take on the tough issues, and create space for others to express themselves. I think, just jump in on that, I think that's a really important point, because when we think about actions and we think about this long list of things that can be actions, giving space to others is an action. That may seem like it comes with risk, but often does not. In fact, there are a couple of examples that I can point to when we working with Lisa, who's on here from Personal Care Products Council. One of the things that we found very early on in the battle over ingredient safety and perceptions is that you're not going to win the argument with facts. You're going to win the argument more likely by saying that you're not afraid to let people see the other side's argument or their science. And that if you bring people together and say, what we care about is getting to the right answer, not just trying to push our agenda or our science, that you get much more credibility. And I think it's a great way to kind of be brave and be bold without taking a strong position, just by acknowledging that there may be different perspectives and that you're not afraid to have those conversations. May be a great way of walking into issues that you're otherwise uncomfortable dealing with. Let's see what else we got here. The laundry list. We have so many benefits, but maybe we need to highlight one or two. Benefits more strongly or rather than an exhaustive list. I'd love for you to tell the Hillary story about laundry listing.
Oh, so it's really, the laundry listing challenge is one that is something that we've tracked for a long time. I think when we have a client who comes to us and starts a conversation saying, well, if our customers only knew X, Y, Z, and they start laundry listing all of the good things, we know that we're in the heart of the perfect place for us to be, because what's missing when you're laundry listing is a master narrative. What's missing is an umbrella that makes us all hang together. What's missing is a few things that people can hang on to. And if you know Michael well, which I have known him for a long time now, Michael is better at thinking in threes than any person I've ever met in my entire life. Like I remember, I think one of the first meetings I went to with you was at a pharma client. And like every point you made, it was like, and 3 things. And I was like, how did you just do that? You come in the back room after moderating a session, you'd be like, 3 things stand out to me, right? But you remember those 3 things. So in 2016, we were tracking the election and trying to understand, who was going to win and make sense of the Hillary versus Trump phenomenon that was sort of capturing all of our minds. And I think we thought back then it couldn't get more polarizing than it was then. And fast forward. So I think we always have to be careful about saying that. But one of the things that we saw is that we asked people, what was Hillary Clinton going to do for you? And most people couldn't answer. What's Hillary Clinton America look like? Well, she was really experienced. She was going to be the first female president. I'm with her. But people couldn't say necessarily what she was going to do. When you looked at her communication, right, you go to her website, she had 112 reasons why you should vote for Hillary Clinton. She also listed her policies alphabetically, starting with A, Alzheimer's, and you could scroll for pages, and it went all the way through to Y. And it was exhaustive, but it wasn't complete in that you couldn't then repeat what are 3 things that Hillary Clinton is going to do for you. And I think that was something that really hurt her in the long run. On the other hand, you had Donald Trump, who had 5 things that he was going to do for America. And I'm guessing you can remember what they are today. And whether you like him or not, it was something that was really, really powerful, because when people said, why are you voting for Donald Trump? They could say, I'm voting for Donald Trump because he's going to make America great again, because he's going to build a wall. He's going to cut taxes. He's going to get tough on China. He's going to bring back jobs. You could almost remember still to this day, 4 days later, what his things were. He had a very, very clear, concise message that was repeatable. And it was allowing people to be advocates for him and repeat their message for him. So this isn't an advertisement for Donald Trump, but it was a lesson that we took away for sure on how to avoid laundry listing and make sure you just pick a few things and repeat them over and over again.
And speaking about that, I think we'll take one more question here and then start to wrap up. But on the topic of repetition, that Shirley said that probably companies choose the laundry list approach because we're expecting consumers to remember the details of all, not because we're expecting that, but because different efforts give you the opportunity to have a bigger PR impact because you have more bullets. And so, how do we feel about that? I'll jump in. I think the challenge is that often people only take away the bullets and not the message that's trying to be repeated, and that ends up taking over. Probably the best example of kind of doing that well at scale, I would say, is the Geico advertising campaign, right? It's now probably been 15 years or more of 15 minutes will save you 15% or less. And those were my 3 uses of the number 15, but what they do is they've got all these different executions, but it's never in doubt what their core message is. And so it always comes back to that basic idea and reinforces it. And usually what we see when we've got a laundry list is that, first of all, they're often not brought together in a clear way with a single overarching narrative or message. And even if they are in a subtle way, that is secondary to the bullet point. And so what I think we're saying is, you need to be clear on what your core message is. You may want to support it with different proof points over time, but it should never be in doubt what message you are repeating over and over and over again in order to get it to break through.
It's interesting. I get to co-host a show with Maria Bartiromo on Monday mornings, and you can always tell the guests who have great messages are actually sometimes the most frustrating guests to have, because they're telling their story. You're not allowing your story to get told. So the most prepared guests who have the best message, they might have some proof points too, but they're using that 7 minutes or 4 minutes on air to tell their story. And it's impenetrable by all of us who are trying to ask questions, because they will not allow you to deviate from the story they're trying to tell. And to me, that's really success, because what people are going to leave with from that moment, it might be frustrating on the one side if you're trying to get them to answer another question, but they've told their story and you're going to remember that. And I think that's part of the job of communicators, is to make sure that you have that really tight story, so that no matter where you go, no matter what direction you get pulled, whether it's in an interview, a conversation, or your materials, wherever, you're telling the same thing.
Awesome. So I think we're going to wrap up. Can I wrap up with 3
Sure,
things?
you can. Oh, please do.
Can I do that?
Yeah.
So first of all, I want to thank our team, who's been so instrumental in helping us pull this content together, and Conrad in particular, who's here with us, doing production, and Brittany, who helped put it together. Second, I want to thank you, Lee, for leading the effort on this, and also all of you. I mean, really, this work gets done not just for you, but with you, and we get to learn so much in the conversations that we have and the relationships that we have with you all. And so thank you for giving us the opportunity to take some of your time, and we'll hopefully see you in person really soon.
Please.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.